He watched his empire crumble the moment his translator collapsed until the janitor walked in. Asterisk, asterisk, in the heart of Shanghai's mirrored towers, billionaire CEO Marcus Flint froze his multi-million-dollar merger teetering on a single word. His trusted Chinese translator slumped mid-sentence, eyes rolling back as executives gasped. The room trembled with rising panic, cameras zooming in on his terrified face. Every second felt like an eternity, until an unlikely figure in blue overalls strode forward. Asterisk, asterisk, Marcus Flint had built his fortune on flawless communication, nuance, every glance translated into profit. But when Mei Lin's voice cut out mid-pitch, that control vanished. A hush fell. His board exchanged terrified murmurs. Flashbulbs popped. Marcus felt the weight of 1,000 eyes bearing down. The press, the investors, his family. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized the deal would die here unless someone spoke. He looked at Mei, clutched her throat, her eyes wide in helpless confusion. The pitch was critical, the final moment in a 3-year negotiation that had spanned continents, translators, lawyers, and endless midnight calls. And now, just as she was about to deliver the key clause, her voice failed. No warning, just silence. Her lips moved but no sound came out. Marcus stepped forward, instinctively, almost protectively, but it was too late. The damage was done. The Chinese delegation across the polished glass table stared in confusion, their expressions quickly morphing into skepticism, then withdrawal. Mr. Zhong, the lead negotiator, pushed his chair back half an inch. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to signal retreat. In international business, especially at this level, diplomacy was a performance, and silence was the most deafening misstep. A bead of sweat slid down Marcus's temple. He tried to smile tight, forced and glanced at his tech assistant. Get someone, he hissed. Now but the assistant stood frozen, unsure whether to run or wait for Marcus to explode. Meanwhile, Mei Lin, the translator who had accompanied him through every critical meeting for 2 years, now trembled, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She looked betrayed by her own body. Marcus's mind reeled. Without a translator, he was effectively voiceless. He didn't speak Mandarin, and the rest of his team only had business-level phrases, nothing capable of handling the intricate terminology of this acquisition. And this wasn't just a deal, it was the deal. The one that would cement his global legacy and double the valuation of Flint Technologies overnight. He tried to stall, laughing awkwardly and miming a throatache, gesturing to Mei Lin and pretending to cough. Some delegates raised their brows. Others whispered amongst themselves. The cameras rolled, journalists scribbled, investors stared, fists clenched on their notepads. This wasn't just business, it was spectacle. He heard someone behind him whisper. Trainwreck closed his eyes for half a second to breathe. Then suddenly, a voice, soft, clear, calm. Rugal wakui, wasambamong. The room froze again, but for a different reason. Heads turned. The voice hadn't come from anyone in a suit or tie. It had come from the far corner of the conference hall, near the catering table and janitorial supplies. A man in blue overalls stepped forward. His hair was graying at the temples, and his skin was a deep mahogany, worn but noble. He carried a mop in one hand and a towel tucked into his waistband. No one had noticed him until now, just another part of the hotel machinery, invisible, unseen. Marcus stared at him, puzzled, blinking as if he'd imagined the voice. The man spoke again, this time in English, calm and respectful. If I may, sir, I can help you. Speak Mandarin, Marcus asked, blinking. The man gave a slight bow, fluently. Sirthapord looked around, unsure if this was real or some twisted prank. The Chinese delegation stared, surprised but intrigued. Marcus gestured wildly. Then please. Yes, the janitor stepped forward, handed his mop off to a passing staffer, and approached the table. As he neared, Marcus could see he wasn't just fluent, he was composed, dignified. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes were steady. He bowed to Mr. Zhong and then began speaking in Mandarin. The moment the words flowed from his mouth, something shifted. The tension that had gripped the room melted, like ice in the sun. Mr. Zhong leaned forward, listening carefully. The janitor's, the voice was rhythmic, polite, precise, every tonal inflection perfectly executed. Then he paused, turned to Marcus, and translated seamlessly. He wishes to proceed but requires reassurance on the data sharing clause. Marcus nodded, then whispered to his general counsel, who responded with a new term. The janitor listened carefully, then relayed it back in Mandarin. It was like watching a miracle unfold. Language, the great barrier of empires, now danced effortlessly between them through the mouth of a man no one had noticed before. The next 20 minutes passed in surreal clarity. Marcus answered questions. The janitor translated. The Chinese team nodded. Laughter emerged, even light conversation. By the end, the delegates stood and extended their hands. Contracts were signed. The deal was done. Applause erupted from the American side of the table. Reporters cheered. The pressure valve had finally released. Marcus looked at the man, still calm, still holding his towel. He looked more like a professor than a janitor now. What's your name? Marcus asked, dazed. Harold Jenkins. Sir, Mr. Jenkins, Marcus faltered. Where did you learn Mandarin like that? Harold smiled modestly. Lived in Shanghai for 15 years. Used to teach English literature there. Moved back after my wife passed. That sentence landed like a soft thud in Marcus's chest. And now you're here. Harold nodded as if it made perfect sense. Life goes where it goes, sir. I'm just thankful to be of use. Marcus said nothing. For once, the man who had built an empire on words had none. The rest of the event passed in a blur. Journalists flooded him. Investors shook his hand. Mei Lin was escorted gently to the back for rest. But Marcus's eyes kept drifting back to the doorway, where Harold Jenkins stood quietly, waiting to be told where to go, or perhaps if he could return to the hall to finish mopping. But he never did. Instead, Marcus walked to him, in front of cameras, in front of everyone. He extended a hand. The room fell quiet again. Mr. Jenkins, Marcus said softly. Would you join me for dinner tonight? Harold blinked. Siri want to talk. Not just about today. About you. There was a pause. Then, Harold nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I'd be honored that night. Marcus didn't return to his penthouse suite. He and Harold sat in a small corner booth at a quiet hotel restaurant, sipping jasmine tea. The billionaire truly listened to as Harold spoke about his life, his years teaching abroad, his late wife, the daughter he hadn't seen in 4 years, the reasons he took a janitorial job when the world stopped seeing his value. Marcus, it was silent for most of it, not out of boredom but reverence. It was strange. All his life he had surrounded himself with brilliance, Wall Street sharks, Ivy League prodigies, tech wizards, but none of them had ever made him feel this grounded, this aware. Harold wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't perform, he just was, and that authenticity struck Marcus like a blow he hadn't seen coming. The next morning, Marcus called his board. I want to hire him, he said. Who? Harold Jenkins. With the janitor? No. The translator, the teacher, the human being who just saved up. As the board hesitated. In what role? Create one. Talent like that doesn't stay invisible. If I can help. Eat. A week later, Harold Jenkins was officially hired as the new director of global cultural communications. His salary was 10 times what he'd earned mopping floors. But more importantly, Marcus made sure Harold's voice was heard. When reporters asked Marcus about the biggest moment of the deal, he didn't say profit margins or market penetration. He said one thing: I almost lost everything because I couldn't understand, and I gained it all back when I chose to listen. From then on, Harold stood beside him at every press conference, every overseas meeting. They became a symbol of humility, of redemption, of the power that lives in those the world overlooks. And whenever Marcus told the story, he'd always begin the same way. I thought the most dangerous silence was in business, but the real danger was the silence in myself, the part that didn't see people like Harold. I don't hear silence anymore. I listen, and somewhere, in a corner of a once-forgotten hotel, a mop still leans gently against the wall, a quiet reminder that greatness doesn't always enter in a suit. Sometimes it walks in with a towel, a heart full of wisdom, and a voice the world didn't know it needed. From the back corner of the marble hall emerged Harold Jenkins, the evening's janitor. Dressed in nondescript overalls, he carried only a mop and a roll of paper towels. No one paid him much mind at first, just another uniformed presence among the polished shoes and custom suits. He had stood silently through the entire ordeal, back straight, eyes alert, pretending to clean while absorbing every word with quiet intensity. But when the translator collapsed and panic pulsed through the room like an invisible shockwave, Harold did something no one expected. He cleared his throat, a soft but deliberate sound, and stepped forward until the edges of his worn shoes touched the edge of the conference table. He bowed respectfully toward Marcus Flint, the billionaire CEO whose world had just begun to unravel, and then to the Chinese delegation across the table. Without waiting for permission, without drawing attention to himself, he began to speak. His Mandarin was not just accurate, it was beautiful. There was cadence to it, a depth of knowledge and grace that stunned even the native speakers in the room. Each syllable fell from his lips like a note from a finely tuned instrument, delivered not with showmanship, but with the weight and care of someone who respected the language deeply. The final, critical clause, the one that would determine whether the billion-dollar merger lived or died, rolled effortlessly from his tongue. The tension in the room evaporated as his voice floated over the delegates and executives, steady, precise, imbued with a quiet authority that demanded attention. Stunned silence greeted his words, the type of silence that isn't empty, but full of realization, awe, and the kind of humility that comes when a preconceived world cracks just slightly and lets in a new truth. All eyes turned to Harold. He was no longer just the janitor. He had become something else entirely. Something the world didn't yet have a name for. Something that frightened and fascinated them at once. Mr. Zhang, the lead negotiator on the Chinese side, nodded slowly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He responded in Mandarin, and Harold answered with ease, listening with intent, then translating each phrase into precise English. For Marcus, it was like watching his future being salvaged in real time, not by a PR executive or a senior partner, but by a man who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans. Harold's hands never trembled, his eyes never faltered. There was something about him that felt unshakable. as though he had lived through worse than this, far worse, and come out the other side wiser, not broken. When Marcus looked at him, he saw not a janitor, not even a translator, but a man cloaked in stories untold, a man who had been overlooked for too long. The negotiation continued. 20 minutes, then 40, then nearly an hour passed, and all the while Harold stood, poised and unwavering, a living bridge between two worlds. The room, once filled with the chaos of failure, had become a sanctuary of connection, and when the final documents were passed around and signed, when the pens were set down and the hands were shaken, it was Harold's voice that had made it possible. Applause broke out from the American team, cautious at first, then swelling into genuine celebration. Champagne was poured. Reporters began scribbling new headlines, their earlier predictions of failure now replaced with praise. Yet through it all, Harold remained humble. He stepped back, as if returning to his role in the shadows, as though the light that had touched him for a moment did not belong to him. Marcus was not having it. He stood up, ignoring the noise, the flashing cameras, the congratulatory slaps on the back, and made his way to Harold. The room quieted as the CEO approached the janitor. They watched Marcus extend his hand, a gesture loaded with more than just gratitude. It was a surrender of pride, of assumptions, of every belief he had held about power and value. Harold looked at the hand for a brief moment, then took it with the same grace he had shown with every word he spoke. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. "Harold Jenkins." "Where did you learn Mandarin?" "Shanghai. I lived there for a long time. Taught English literature at a university there before I returned to the States." Marcus blinked. "That's a hell of a journey." Harold shrugged lightly. "Life doesn't always take you where you planned, but it takes you where you need to go." Marcus let that sentence settle in his mind. He knew in that moment that he had misjudged the man in front of him, not just in this room, but in all the rooms he had walked into where men like Harold were present but invisible. Marcus didn't know whether it was guilt or age, but he knew something inside him had shifted. This was not a man you ignored. That evening, instead of celebrating with investors or hosting an afterparty, Marcus invited Harold to dinner, not at the Grand Hotel ballroom where the executives gathered, but at a small restaurant down the street, a place with no reservations and handwritten menus. Harold hesitated at first, but Marcus insisted. "I want to hear your story. I owe you that." They sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth. The lighting was soft, the music distant, and for the first time in years, Marcus rarely listened. Harold spoke softly, never once embellishing, never seeking pity. He talked about his years in Shanghai, about meeting his wife there, about her illness, about how he had returned to the United States after her passing with no plan, no position, only a need to survive. He took the janitorial job not because it suited his qualifications, but because it was what was available, because he needed to work, needed to feel useful. "You ever miss teaching?" Marcus asked. "Every day," Harold replied, "but people don't always see the teacher anymore. They just see the uniform." Marcus fell quiet. He thought about all the boardrooms he had sat in, all the handshakes and headlines and power plays. He thought about the people who served coffee, who cleaned tables, who held open the doors. He thought about how many Harolds he had walked past without ever turning his head. The next morning, Marcus called his executive assistant, find out everything about Harold Jenkins. "I want to hire him." The assistant hesitated. "You mean for people?" "I mean really hire him. Give him a role. Build it if it doesn't exist. Someone like that doesn't belong in the shadows." A week later, Harold was brought into the Flint Technologies headquarters. He sat in a conference room surrounded by suits and executives, but this time, he wasn't holding a mop. He was wearing a tailored blazer, still modest, still him, but different now. "Scene." Marcus introduced him to the board as the new director of global cultural communications. There were a few raised eyebrows, but no one objected. How could they, after what he had done? They all knew the story. They had all witnessed the moment when everything was slipping away, and the janitor had stepped in to save them. Over the months that followed, Harold redefined his role. He didn't just translate words, he translated cultures, perspectives, human experiences. He taught the company how to see people, how to listen beyond accents and job titles. He initiated language exchange programs within the firm, mentored young interns from marginalized backgrounds, and quietly became one of the most respected people in the building. Marcus often found himself drawn to Harold's office, which was always open, always welcoming. Sometimes they would talk business. Other times they would talk life, grief, love, aging, legacy. In Harold, Marcus found something he had never had in his climb to the top, a mentor of the heart. Their bond became known throughout the company, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. And in a world where everything was curated and branded, their friendship was refreshingly human. One day, a young intern nervously approached Harold after a company event and asked him how he found the courage to speak up that day. Harold smiled gently and said, "Sometimes the room is waiting for a voice that doesn't sound like the others. I just happened to be that voice." But Marcus, who overheard, added something else. "The truth is, the room had already decided who was allowed to speak." Harold didn't just use his voice, he reminded us that we were listening to the wrong people all along. Years later, long after the deal that had brought them together was just another chapter in Flint Technologies' history, Marcus stood on with stage at a leadership summit, giving a keynote speech about transformation. He told the audience about Harold Jenkins not as an employee, not as a miracle, but as a man who had changed his view of the world. "We spend so much of our time trying to be heard," Marcus said, "but the real strength lies in listening. Not just to the loudest voice, but to the quietest one in the corner, the one we overlooked at night." The audience stood in a long ovation, but Harold wasn't there to hear it. He was home, watering the flowers in his small garden, talking on the phone with his daughter, now a professor in Chicago. He didn't need applause. He had already spoken his truth, and the world had finally listened. As Harold completed the translation, relief rippled through the room like dawn breaking over a stormy sea. The stiff postures of the board members softened. Murmurs of stress transformed into nervous chuckles, and the foreign delegates, once cold and withdrawn, nodded with calm understanding. The air in the boardroom, which moments earlier had been thick with unspoken panic, was now filled with the quiet rhythm of pens scratching paper. Contracts were signed. One by one, the deal came to life on the weight of ink and the strength of unexpected words. Cameras recorded every handshake, every exchange of affirming glances. The crisis had not only been averted, it had become an origin story, a moment that would echo in the company's lore for decades. Marcus closed his eyes. The weight of the day and the weight of his own arrogance pressed down on him. He wasn't just relieved that the deal had gone through. He wasn't just grateful that his company's valuation had doubled in the span of a single afternoon. He was humbled, deeply and uncomfortably. He saw himself now clearly in the mirrored walls of that high-rise conference room, a man who had built an empire on vision, yet failed to see the worth of the man who walked his halls every day. Marcus swallowed pride and prejudice in one breath, and it burned going down. His eyes settled on Harold still in his blue overalls, now standing a little straighter, still holding the towel he had tucked into his belt like a badge of service. He had not changed, but everything else had in a room built for power. Harold was now the most powerful presence. Marcus took a step forward, ignoring the CEO from Germany who was still shaking hands, bypassing his own chief legal advisor who was eager to review the final clause, and walked directly to Harold. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Marcus extended a hand, not as a token gesture, but as an offering. He didn't just shake Harold's hand. He clasped it with both of his, holding it as one might hold on to something sacred. "Come sit with us," Marcus said quietly, nodding toward the long table where the leaders of the world's largest corporations were now seated with glasses of champagne. "Sir, you don't need to mop the floor today, Harold," Marcus interrupted, his voice laced with a trembling sincerity. "Today, you lead the room." There was hesitation in Harold's eyes, not fear, but the cautious instinct of a man who had learned not to expect recognition. A man who had carried dignity in silence for so long. He wasn't sure what to do with applause, but he nodded once, slowly, and followed Marcus toward the table. The walk was short, but it felt like a march through history. Executives turned, conversations paused, forks were set down, and in that suspended moment, a man in overalls pulled out a chair at the head table of billionaires. No one objected. No one scoffed. They only watched. And Harold sat down, not because he had been invited, but because he belonged. The dinner that followed was subdued, not with tension but with awe. Harold spoke little. He didn't need to. When he did speak about teaching in China, about his late wife's work as a linguist, about poetry and translation and the art of listening, he held the attention of the room like a master conductor. Marcus, once the loudest voice in any space, found himself listening more than speaking. He kept stealing glances at Harold, trying to reconcile the man before him with the invisible worker he had passed for years without notice. After the guests dispersed and the conference floor was cleared, Marcus stood alone at the edge of the city skyline. The lights below flickered like neurons in a great sleeping mind. Somewhere behind him, Harold was quietly gathering his belongings, already halfway into disappearing again. Marcus turned. "Walk with me." They took the elevator down in silence. The lobby was nearly empty, and the marble floors echoed under their feet. Marcus stopped near the revolving door, watching Harold prepare to exit. "Let me ask you something," Marcus said. "Why didn't you ever speak up before?" Harold smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how often people only want to hear from the ones wearing suits. I've spoken before, just not with words. You were a professor. I was a husband first, then a professor, then a widower, now a janitor. Or maybe I've been all those things at once." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "You're more than a janitor. You know that, right?" Harold nodded gently. "I never doubted it. But thank you. Come work with me," Marcus said, stepping forward. "Come into the company. We'll build a position that suits you. Cultural advisor, translator, mentor, whatever you want." Harold chuckled softly. "You don't have to give me anything. I'm not giving you anything. I'm trying to learn from youth." That made Harold pause. He studied Marcus with that same quiet gaze that had calmed a room of billionaires. Then he said, "I'll come, but only if you let me keep speaking the way I did today's yourself." "Exactly." "Then it's done." That Monday, Marcus called a meeting of his senior executives. They gathered in a glass-walled room lined with high-end art and an endless view of the city. He stood at the head of the table, a screen behind him glowing with a new title. Harold Jenkins, Director of Human Insight and Cultural Language Integration. There was some confusion, a few subtle raised eyebrows, a silent question in the air. Marcus answered it before anyone could speak. This man saved your bonuses. He saved our reputation. But more than that, he showed us that intelligence doesn't always wear a tie. From this day forward, we don't just hire talent, we learn to recognize it in all forms. If any of you have a problem with that, there's the door. No one left. Harold entered the room wearing a blazer over his blue shirt, no tie. He smiled politely. The executives stood as he walked in. Respect had a new shape. Over the next 6 months, Harold became more than a title. He became a symbol. He redesigned internal training programs to include cultural humility, launched a mentorship initiative for support staff, and created language immersion labs within the company to improve global communication. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, entire departments shifted. People began talking about the Harold effect, a sudden quiet boost in morale that seemed to follow wherever he went. Security guards smiled more. Junior analysts asked deeper questions. Secretaries began sitting in on language seminars with executives, learning alongside them instead of being expected to simply serve them. One day, a receptionist approached Harold and whispered, "Because of you, I finally signed up to finish my degree." Harold simply said, "That's the smartest thing I've heard all week." Marcus, meanwhile, found his own leadership style transforming. He no longer barked orders. He asked. He no longer treated efficiency as the highest goal. Instead, he sought understanding. On more than one occasion, he paused meetings to say, "Let's take a moment and ask what we're not hearing," and Harold would quietly nod from his seat in the corner. When a major investor questioned why someone with no formal business degree was sitting on the leadership team, Marcus replied, "He has the rarest kind of education, life, and it's made him fluent in people. That's more than I can say for most MBAs." The investor didn't argue. Outside of work, Harold's life slowly shifted as well. He reconnected with his daughter, who had been distant since his wife passed. She flew out to visit him, surprised to find her father working in a skyscraper instead of a service closet. She cried when she saw his name on the office door. "You finally got the world to see what I've always known," she said, hugging him tightly. Harold didn't speak. He just held her. The story of the janitor turned executive made its way into national headlines. News outlets requested interviews. He declined most of them. "I didn't do this to be seen," he told Marcus. "I did it because someone needed to speak." When the room went quiet still, when a university asked him to give a commencement address, he agreed. He stood at the podium in front of thousands of graduates and said, "The world will measure you by titles, but life will measure you by your ability to listen, to notice the invisible, to choose humility when it's easier to be loud. I wore a mop on my belt while holding the knowledge of 2 continents in my head. Don't let the world tell you where you belong. Speak anyway." The students rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous that night. Marcus wrote Harold a letter. "You didn't just save a deal. You saved a man from becoming hollow. I don't want to be a king. I want to be a listener. You taught me that." Harold kept the letter in his drawer, beside a picture of his wife and the first student he ever taught in Shanghai. Years passed. The company grew. New offices opened in Beijing, Nairobi, Rio, and Dubai. Harold's programs were now standard practice across every international division. His name became shorthand for ethical leadership and inclusive communication. New hires were taught the Jenkins principle on day one. See the person before the position. Eventually, Harold announced he was retiring. Marcus called an emergency all-hands meeting. The entire company tuned in. "I built this company with ambition," Marcus said. But Harold gave it its soul. When Harold walked into the room, the applause lasted for 7 minutes. People wept. Former janitors, now department heads, hugged him. Senior partners bowed. And when Harold stepped up to the microphone, he didn't thank anyone. He simply said, "I'm not leaving. I'm just stepping aside so others can rescend with that." He walked out of the room, leaving behind a legacy not etched in gold but in hearts. Marcus watched him go, the mop still leaning in the corner of his office as a quiet reminder. Greatness doesn't always walk in with noise. Sometimes it walks in with a towel, a quiet voice, and the power to change everything without ever needing to say it twice. If this story stirs your soul, please subscribe. Join our community of dreamers, believers, and everyday heroes. Hit the bell so you never miss a tale of hope rising from the shadows.